The flash arrived before the word. From 30,000 feet, a bright, merciless bloom cut the morning open. A white sun blooming where a city had been. Within minutes, roofs evaporated, trees turned to shadows, and a heat that should not exist in any world rolled over streets and people and prayers. Back on the island of Tinian, officers watched a small rectangle of steel fall away from a bomber and disappear toward its destiny. In the deserts and factories of America, newspapermen and clerks, mothers and soldiers looked up at the same sky of the 20th century and blinked, unsure which miracle or horror they had just summoned. In the White House, a fresh-faced Midwesterner paced the halls. Harry Truman, who had taken the oath in the wake of Roosevelt's death and been thrust overnight from Senate rooms to the center of the globe. We tell this story as if it were simple, a single act that ended a terrible war. But history is never simple. The moment a bomb made a city vanish, a new era began. A calculus in which victory could be weighed in civilian bodies, and where moral language would forever strain against military necessity. Advocates would call it salvation. Critics would name it the birth of a crime. Both would claim history as their witness. This is not just a tale of technology and strategy. It is the story of a man with a stamp of obligation on his soul, of telegrams and scientific reports, of tired generals and anxious diplomats, of the smoke and the silence that followed the first flash. It is the story of a choice that seemed to promise an end, and yet opened a door from which no one could withdraw intact. What then did Harry S. Truman actually decide to do on those summer days of 1945? And what does that choice tell us about the limits of necessity, the scale of moral responsibility, and the shape of the world that followed? Harry S. Truman's presidency began in the shadow of another man's unfinished empire and ended in the dawn of a terrifying new world. When he inherited the Oval Office in April 1945, he inherited not only the Second World War but also a secret, a weapon capable of erasing entire cities. The decision to use that weapon would define his name and haunt history. To Truman, the atomic bomb was both a burden and a solution. It promised to end a war that had consumed millions of lives, to prevent a bloody invasion of Japan, and to bring American soldiers home. But it also demanded that he accept something no other leader in human history had faced: the deliberate annihilation of civilian populations as an act of state. In the days leading to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, morality and strategy became indistinguishable. Truman did not merely authorize an attack. He altered the moral architecture of modern warfare. This story is not about whether he was right or wrong. It is about the moment humanity crossed an invisible line. It is about how one decision, made in a room of weary men, turned victory into an existential question. Can peace built on total destruction ever be called peace at all? Harry S. Truman was born on a Missouri farm in 1884, far from the polished circles of Washington or the commanding heights of power. He grew up plowing fields, reading history by lamplight, and listening to his mother's unwavering belief that duty was not a choice. It was the measure of a man. He was not destined for greatness. There was no Ivy League education, no family fortune, no dynasty behind his name. When World War I came, Truman enlisted and became a captain in the artillery, leading men through the chaos of France. There, among mud and fear, he discovered a strength that neither privilege nor pedigree could provide: the ability to remain calm when everything around him was falling apart. After the war, he returned to Missouri with nothing but integrity and persistence. Politics at first was an accident. Backed by Kansas City's infamous Pendergast political machine, he ran for county judge, then for the U.S. Senate. In Washington, his reputation grew not from charm or rhetoric, but from an unshakable honesty. Truman became known as the man who couldn't be bought. When Franklin D. Roosevelt chose him as vice president in 1944, it was almost an afterthought, a compromise ticket. Truman himself had no illusions of becoming president. Yet only 82 days after taking office as vice president, Roosevelt was dead, and Truman was handed the heaviest burden of the 20th century. He had never been briefed on the Manhattan Project. In fact, when Secretary of War Henry Stimson first mentioned a new weapon of unusual destructive force, Truman thought he meant a conventional explosive. Within weeks, he learned the truth: that scientists had harnessed the energy of the atom and built a bomb whose power surpassed imagination. The man who had spent his life mastering practical problems, debt, politics, war logistics, now faced a moral dilemma unlike any before. The weight of that decision would rest not on a general or scientist, but on a man from Independence, Missouri, who still carried a farmer's sense of right and wrong. He would later write in his diary, "The final decision had to be made by the president, and no one else could make it." And in that simple sentence lay both his strength and the tragedy that followed. When Truman took the oath of office on April 12, 1945, the world was collapsing and reshaping itself at once. Nazi Germany was weeks from surrender. Japan, though cornered, refused to yield. Roosevelt's cabinet, stunned by their leader's sudden death, looked upon Truman as a caretaker, a man meant to manage, not to decide. He proved them wrong within weeks. Truman's first act as president was to assert control. He met with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, and scientists from the top-secret Manhattan Project. What they revealed was a weapon that could end the war in days, or redefine humanity's capacity for destruction forever. The project, led by General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, had consumed more than $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people across the United States. Yet until that spring, the man responsible for using the bomb had known nothing of its existence. Truman's instinct was not curiosity, but clarity. His presidency would be defined by decisive leadership. As he once told his advisors, "I don't pass the buck, and I don't take it from anyone else." That conviction would soon be tested by the gravest choice imaginable. In the interim committee, a group of civilian and military leaders formed to advise the president. Debate raged. Should the bomb be used as a demonstration first? Should Japan be warned? Should the emperor be preserved to negotiate surrender? Truman listened, but rarely spoke. He understood that while the scientists saw ethical dilemmas, the generals saw strategy, and he, as president, saw history. The Allies' demand for unconditional surrender had boxed Japan into a corner. American military planners estimated that invading the Japanese mainland could cost 1 million Allied casualties. The war in the Pacific had already revealed the fanatical resistance of Japanese forces. At Okinawa alone, 12,000 Americans had died, and over 100,000 Japanese perished. Truman's advisors, particularly Stimson and General Marshall, argued that a swift, overwhelming blow could end the war without an invasion. Secretary of State James Burns added another layer. The bomb, he suggested, might also send a message to Stalin, a demonstration of American supremacy before the post-war order began. Behind closed doors, moral philosophy gave way to geopolitical calculus. The language of duty was replaced by numbers, targets, and tonnage. On July 16, 1945, as Truman attended the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin, the first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert. The code word from the test site read, "The baby is born." Truman smiled quietly, then wrote in his diary, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley after Noah and his fabulous ark." He now held the power of apocalypse and the decision of whether to use it. The decision was not made in a single meeting. It evolved, shaped by telegrams, reports, fears, and silence. By late July 1945, the atomic bomb was ready. 2 targets had been chosen: Hiroshima, an industrial and military center largely untouched by previous bombing raids, and Nagasaki, a port city vital to Japan's war production. Each was meant to display the weapon's full destructive power, not merely to the enemy, but to the world. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman received a coded message from Secretary of War Stimson. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory. It was confirmation that the first atomic test in New Mexico, the Trinity test, had succeeded. The explosion had vaporized a desert tower, turning sand into glass and lighting the dawn of a new age. When Stalin asked about the new weapon, Truman mentioned it casually. "We have a new weapon of unusual destructive force." Stalin nodded, pretending disinterest, though his spies had already informed him of the bomb's success. That same week, Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender or prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government split between moderates and hardliners. The emperor remained silent. And so, the decision, one that would define modern history, fell entirely on Truman's shoulders. In his diary, he wrote, "This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. The target will be a military objective, avoiding women and children as far as possible." The qualification, as far as possible, revealed everything about the moral geometry of modern warfare. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a bomb nicknamed Little Boy. 43 seconds later, Hiroshima ceased to exist. A blast hotter than the surface of the sun leveled 5 square miles of the city. In an instant, over 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks from burns and radiation. 3 days later, August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell over Nagasaki. Another 40,000 lives ended in moments. For Truman, the days that followed were filled with mixed triumph and unease. He received reports of Japan's surrender preparations and declared victory to the nation with the now famous words, "We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." Yet even as crowds cheered in the streets, questions emerged behind closed doors. Admiral William Leahy, his chief of staff, warned, "In being the first to use it, we have adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." Truman dismissed the criticism. "I never lost any sleep over it," he said later, "for I did what I thought was right." But the images that arrived from Japan, the burned faces, the ruins, the silence, began to shift public conscience. Scientists who had once built the weapon now recoiled at its consequence. The physicist Leo Szilard, who had helped conceive the chain reaction, called it the first step toward annihilation. Truman's private notes betray no regret, only resolve. He saw the bomb as a tool, terrible, yes, but necessary. To him, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not moral failures, but moral trade-offs, the lesser evil that prevented the greater one. Yet history would not stop at that calculation. When the smoke cleared, the world had changed. Empires ended, superpowers rose, and humanity entered an age where peace depended not on faith, but on the fear of its own inventions. On the morning after Nagasaki, Truman told his cabinet, "This is the greatest thing in history." And in a way, it was. For greatness, in history's cruel dictionary, has never meant goodness. The atomic bomb was not a single weapon, it was a policy. A convergence of science, fear, and power that redefined the modern state. Truman's decision was shaped by calculations that now seem both cold and convincing. Military advisors projected that a conventional invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, could cost up to 1 million Allied casualties and several million Japanese lives. Every week the war continued, American soldiers died in the Pacific, and civilians starved across Asia. By that arithmetic, the bomb appeared merciful. A single shock, they believed, would spare an ocean of blood. In the immediate aftermath, this logic held. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's radio address, the first time his people had ever heard his voice, described the atomic weapon as a new and most cruel bomb. Truman's popularity soared. American newspapers hailed him as the man who ended the war. A weary nation celebrated not the weapon, but the relief it brought. But history, as always, did not stop at victory. The bomb's consequences multiplied, politically, scientifically, and spiritually. First came the strategic transformation. The monopoly of atomic power gave the United States unprecedented leverage in shaping the post-war order. Within months, the bomb became not just a deterrent, but a diplomatic instrument. It altered the tone of negotiations with Stalin, influencing the foundation of the Cold War. The atomic shadow hung over every treaty, every speech, every border. Second came the scientific dilemma. The Manhattan Project scientists, Oppenheimer, Szilard, Fermi, had entered the war believing knowledge could save humanity. Now they confronted the opposite. Many organized the Federation of Atomic Scientists, warning that nuclear energy, if left to politics alone, would destroy civilization. But the genie was out. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its own bomb, and the world entered an age of permanent vigilance. Third came the moral reckoning. For the first time, mankind saw destruction so vast it defied theology. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became not just tragedies, but mirrors. They forced philosophers, theologians, and politicians to redefine the ethics of war. Could any cause justify annihilation? Could victory erase responsibility? Truman insisted the answer was yes, that using the bomb was no more immoral than firebombing Tokyo or Dresden. War, he said, is inherently immoral, but sometimes it is necessary. His critics, however, argued that necessity had become a disguise for convenience, that the bombs were dropped not because Japan could not be defeated, but because America wanted to end the war on its own terms and intimidate the Soviets before peace began. In truth, both readings coexist. Truman's decision was not driven by cruelty or by calculation alone. It was driven by exhaustion, the collective wariness of a world that had bled for 6 years and could not imagine another month. But exhaustion, history reminds us, is the most dangerous fuel for power, for it makes every action, even the irreversible, feel like mercy. Even as the war ended, the moral aftershocks of Truman's decision began to ripple through governments, universities, and conscience itself. What had been celebrated as triumph soon became one of the most debated acts in human history. The first wave of dissent came not from politicians, but from scientists, the very architects of the bomb. In July 1945, even before Hiroshima, a group led by Leo Szilard petitioned the president to demonstrate the weapon first, on an uninhabited island, under international observation. The petition never reached Truman's desk. It was quietly suppressed by the military. After the bombings, Szilard lamented, "We have been the destroyers of worlds, and we knew it." Inside Truman's own cabinet, unease grew. Admiral William D. Leahy declared that the use of this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later confessed that he hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon. Yet none of them openly defied the president at the time. Publicly, America justified the bomb as the only path to peace. Privately, the narrative fractured. Declassified intelligence decades later revealed that Japan had already begun seeking terms of surrender before Hiroshima, though not the unconditional surrender the Allies demanded. This revelation reignited the question: was the bomb necessary, or was it a political message to Moscow? Historians remain divided. Some argue that Truman acted under the moral and strategic logic of total war, a continuation of firebombing campaigns that had already reduced Tokyo to ashes. Others contend that he sought to shape the post-war order, proving American dominance before Stalin could advance further in Asia. The controversy deepened in 1946, when the Atomic Energy Commission replaced military control of nuclear weapons. Public hearings revealed the terrifying scale of what had been unleashed, and the impossibility of putting it back. The age of secrecy gave birth to the age of fear. Truman's personal response was consistent and unyielding. He refused to apologize, stating, "I made the decision to save lives. That is my only motive." Yet even within that certainty, his aides noted a quiet fatigue, the weight of knowing that his signature had introduced humanity to a new moral frontier. In later years, as nuclear stockpiles grew and new generations studied the ruins of Hiroshima, Truman's decision ceased to be a question of history. It became a mirror, forcing every leader after him to ask whether power, once absolute, can ever again be used innocently. History remembers Harry S. Truman as both savior and executioner, the man who ended one war and began another kind of war entirely. His presidency marked not the close of World War II, but the opening act of the nuclear century, when humanity learned that survival itself could depend on restraint. In the short term, Truman's decision achieved what he intended: Japan's unconditional surrender, the preservation of countless Allied soldiers' lives, and the solidification of American leadership in the New World Order. His approval ratings soared, and the United States emerged from the conflict not merely victorious, but transformed into a superpower. Yet, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki transcended victory. The atomic bomb became both symbol and scar, a testament to human ingenuity and a warning of its cost. Truman's choice introduced a new vocabulary into political ethics: deterrence, mutually assured destruction, existential risk. From that point forward, peace would depend on fear, the knowledge that any future war could end all wars, and with them, civilization itself. Truman saw himself as a man of necessity. He often said, "I never gave it a second thought after the decision was made." But history did. Every generation since has wrestled with the same dilemma. Does morality end when survival begins? His defenders claim he carried the unbearable burden so others would not have to. that by choosing horror once, he spared humanity from repeating it. His critics counter that he opened a door no one could close, proving that even democracies can rationalize devastation if they convince themselves it's for the greater good. Both are true. That is the paradox of power and of Truman himself. The ultimate lesson of his presidency is not about right or wrong, but about thresholds. Every age reaches a moment when progress outpaces wisdom, when technology tempts leaders to act faster than morality can respond. Truman stood at that edge, and he chose to leap. The world that followed, from the Cold War to today's fragile deterrence, still lives in the light of that decision. A light born in the skies over Hiroshima, bright enough to reveal everything humanity can do, and everything it must never do again. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. For the people of Hiroshima, the morning began like any other. Children walked to school, fishermen rowed into the bay, housewives hung their laundry under a clear blue sky. Then, in a single instant, the sun fell to earth. Hours later, as the fires subsided, silence claimed the city. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of disbelief, of a world trying to comprehend what it had done. In Washington, President Truman sat at his desk, surrounded by maps, telegrams, and a nation that now looked to him as the man who ended the war. He had fulfilled his duty, yet even he could not foresee how far the echo of that choice would travel. The atomic bomb had not only ended a conflict, it had ended certainty. Decades later, as veterans aged and cities rebuilt, the question still lingers. Did Truman make the right choice? History offers no comfort. It only offers perspective. His decision stands not as an answer, but as a mirror, reflecting every generation's capacity to weigh survival against humanity. The power he unleashed still hovers over us, in silos, in treaties, in nightmares. The same flash that ended a war continues to define the boundaries of our morality. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Harry S. Truman, that the most ordinary man ever to hold the presidency made the most extraordinary decision in human history, and left the world forever asking whether we were ready for the power we gave ourselves.